Hi folks, welcome back. Earlier this week, OpenAI released apps in ChatGPT, and I think this has some very deep strategic implications for how AI is used, how it's rolled out. So here are some half-baked thoughts on what this means, how the future might unfold, and how we should be thinking about it. All right, let's start by first understanding the mechanics of it. How exactly does it work? So the idea is that a full app UI will be embedded within the ChatGPT chat, within the conversation itself. And the really interesting thing is how these apps are invoked or brought into the conversation. They have two modes for doing it. One is you could invoke the app directly by name. So you could say, I want the Expedia app and I want it to do such and such. Or this is the more interesting one. Based on how your conversation is going, the model itself can suggest and bring an app into the conversation. This is the more powerful and more interesting way of invoking apps. A couple of other things, they have a nice buy and checkout flow, so you can complete a transaction entirely within the chat flow in the native app UI, but you don't have to leave ChatGPT. This is also very important. And identity is handled via an OAuth mechanism. So the first time you invoke an app, you will do the standard OAuth dance to sign into the app and then have OpenAI use the app. Strategically, one interesting lens to look at this through is aggregation theory. This is by Ben Thompson over at Stratechery, and he puts forward this lens as the way that all the big companies of the internet era achieved their success and dominance. Companies like Netflix and Google and Airbnb, they all worked because they aggregated demand. So, for example, Google aggregated users behind the Google search engine, and then they commoditized suppliers. So everyone that was producing content on the web were essentially commoditized because all users practically would reach these suppliers via the aggregator. So the aggregator got tremendous advantages, tremendous leverage because they controlled demand, they aggregated demand. And the suppliers had to go through the aggregator in order to reach their users and to satisfy that demand. And this obviously gave the aggregator companies like Google and Netflix and so on a lot of power over the market and over these suppliers. So aggregation theory is an important idea to keep in mind as we go through this. Now, moving on, obviously the big comparison here is to app stores. This very much looks and feels like an app store for the AI age. And so it naturally draws comparisons to existing app stores. The most well-known of those are, of course, the mobile phone app stores, things like the Apple or Android app stores. Another really interesting comparison, though, is mini apps in WeChat. And if you look at that ecosystem, in China, WeChat is so dominant and you can do pretty much everything. You can pay for stuff, you can buy event tickets, you can pay at restaurants. You can do all that inside WeChat, but WeChat is just one app, and all these other mini apps live inside WeChat. So that might be a more apt comparison than the Apple and Android app stores. Now, the reason I started out by mentioning aggregation theory is that you have to think about how, in these traditional app stores, the user engages with the app, what the app surface looks like, and what discovery looks like. And in these app stores, the user is still very much in control. They're making active choices. And then the app offers a very bespoke and somewhat immersive experience to the user. So if I'm on my iPhone, I, as a user, still have to decide which app to tap on and open. If I want to buy stuff, I'm going to open the Amazon app. If I want to book a hotel room, I'm going to open a Marriott or the Hilton app, and so on. So discovery is still very much intentional and user driven. I know the apps I want. I have manually selected and installed them on my phone. And then at the time of wanting to use them, I make a conscious decision to start that app. And once the app is started, the surface also is very bespoke and very immersive. The app is full screen. I'm fully engaged in that one app until I switch over to another app. But the mechanics of ChatGPT apps are very, very different because I'm guessing a majority of app invocations will happen when the model suggests it. So if my chat is unfolding in a way that indicates I want to book tickets to some destination, ChatGPT will bring in the Expedia app or the Booking.com app. And from the point of view of the app provider, they are getting commoditized because the user didn't explicitly ask for a specific travel provider. They didn't explicitly ask for Expedia. Expedia just happened to offer functionality related to making travel bookings, and the model matched the intent of the user with that given app. So app builders and suppliers are being commoditized, but they need to be in here because they need access to users. So yes, there is a comparison with traditional app stores, but the app is very much a secondary participant rather than a primary surface that the user directly engages with. Another big factor, of course, is monetization. OpenAI haven't released any monetization details yet. They said they're still working on it. But just for comparison's sake, on the iPhone and Android app stores, the take rate is usually around 30%. So if you do some transaction on an app, the Google Play Store or Apple take 30% of the value of that transaction. WeChat, on the other hand, is much, much lower, probably because the volume is so much higher. So every time you do a transaction on WeChat, they take an average of just about 0.6% of that transaction. And that brings us to the central most important point of apps within a conversational AI service, and that is intent. The reason Google was so dominant in the internet era with ads and online commerce was because a search query was a very explicit declaration of intent. If my search query was flowers, that was a strong indication that I want to buy flowers, and so on. The gap that AI has revealed is that search queries are usually very short, a few words long at most, whereas a chat has much more nuance, much more detail, much more context. I could be having a very long chat about something I want to buy, or what kind of thing I want to buy, what color, what size, or if I want to travel, where I want to travel, what kind of places I want to stay at, what kind of cities I'd like to visit. And all that gives you much, much more context and information about the intent of the user. And that intent can then be matched up with some kind of commercial transaction or a provider who can offer a way to complete that transaction. So the gap from intent to action becomes much, much shorter. And this goes back to the mechanics of apps in ChatGPT. Based on your intent, the model could suggest an app, say Expedia, and then you can buy and check out within that little app experience, but while remaining in the chat. This, I think, is the most important implication of apps inside an AI surface. The idea that the user intent can be very nuanced, very detailed, and very, very specific. And then these apps essentially become like tool calls. We've all done tool calling and things like MCP, when building agents, and this is essentially a slightly up-leveled version of that. If you have an array of apps that can serve various intents or carry out various actions, you bring them into the chat as and when needed. And from the point of view of the app providers themselves, I don't think this is great news because, say you're Expedia, the user in ChatGPT doesn't really care about completing a booking specifically through Expedia. They just care about completing a booking. And Expedia happens to be a provider of that action, the action of completing a travel booking. But if there are other providers, the model will happily pick those other providers because what the model cares about is understanding and then satisfying an intent, no matter who the provider of carrying out that intent is. So just like aggregation theory predicts, the suppliers or the app builders in this case will become commoditized. And you can see that, of course, even in the surface, because, like we said, unlike on an iPhone, where the app is the primary surface when you start an app, in this case, the conversational chat is the primary surface, and the app is a secondary experience that comes into the chat. The chat is the main container. All right, let's end this discussion with a hypothetical question, which is that why would OpenAI not directly use underlying APIs? Why would they even go through apps? And why would they want to bring in apps into the chat as going directly to underlying APIs? For example, if you want to complete travel bookings, there are well-known established APIs from companies like Sabre and Amadeus that let you do that. In an alternate universe, OpenAI could have gone directly to those APIs instead of bringing in apps like Expedia or Booking.com. So what are the trade-offs there? The biggest ones really are that if you're OpenAI, you don't want to deal with the domain complexity of this app, travel in this case. You don't want to deal with all the operations and liability and compliance and the domain logic of how to book tickets, deal with tickets, cancel tickets, handle payments, all that stuff. So OpenAI are essentially offloading all that domain complexity to these app providers and just invoking the app rather than the underlying APIs. But that complexity is also a sliding scale. You can imagine plenty of apps where the domain complexity isn't that high, and a capable model working directly with an API could handle that domain complexity without needing an app as a go-between. The other really interesting potential here is of generative UI, and I'm talking about what was demonstrated by experiments like Imagine by Claude, where they released a preview, a research preview, where depending on what you prompted, the entire UI was generated at runtime. So this is not like Lovable or Replit where you vibe code a UI, so there's still code generated and then you're running the code for the UI. This was the LLM at runtime generating each new screen or each new dialogue. So I think down the line, you might have Gen UI fill in the gaps for where you need some kind of an app surface on top of direct API calls. And then you won't even need an app builder in the mix anymore. You can, at runtime, synthesize a good domain-specific application experience. Anyway, so just wanted to quickly get out some thoughts on the strategic implications of apps in ChatGPT. I hope you enjoyed that. If you like content like this, please consider subscribing, like the video, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.